Picture this. A man is dragged across a field of the dead, his wrists bound behind him, stumbling because the guards will not let him find his feet. His fine coat is torn, his mouth is dry, and at the far end of that field, waiting for him beneath a war banner, stands the one man he betrayed above all others, his own uncle. The prisoner has a name that half of Albania once respected. His name is Hamza Kastrioti. We're told this is a story about a small nation and a giant empire, a handful of mountain warriors against the largest military power on earth, good against evil, David against Goliath in an iron helmet, and in a sense, it is all of those things. But the truth underneath is stranger and far more human, because the enemy dragged across that field was not a foreigner. He was blood, he was family. He shared a name, a table, and a childhood with the very commander who had just annihilated the army he rode with. This was not only Albania against the Ottomans, it was Kastrioti against Kastrioti. The chroniclers who recorded what happened on that plain wrote of thousands of prisoners taken in a single night, of an imperial army shattered in the space of a few dark hours, of banners captured and camps overrun. Their numbers are enormous, and we will treat those numbers with care because medieval writers love to make giants out of armies. But even the cautious historians agree on the shape of it. On the 2nd of September, in the year 1457, on a plain the Albanians called Albulena, something happened that should not have been possible. A cornered rebel, written off by half of Europe, hunted for weeks through his own mountains, turned and destroyed the force sent to erase him. So how does a man on the edge of ruin turn the greatest empire of the age into a fleeing mob overnight? And what kind of commander looks at his captured, treacherous nephew and has to decide in that moment whether the man before him is still family or simply another prisoner of war? Before we keep going, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and if you're enjoying the story, hit subscribe, because what happened next in the mountains of Albania is one of those moments history almost forgot, and things are about to get intense. To understand that night, you have to understand the world that produced it. You have to understand why an empire that had just swallowed the greatest city in Christendom would spend so much blood and iron on a strip of mountains most of Europe could barely find on a map. You have to understand the man they were hunting and the long, grinding 25-year war that had already made his name a curse in the Sultan's court. And you have to understand how betrayal, real betrayal, the kind that comes from within a family, set the stage for one of the most stunning reversals in the history of medieval warfare. It begins not on the plain of Albulena, but in a world that was, quite literally, coming apart. To the people living through it, the middle of the 15th century felt like the closing of a door. For 1,000 years, there had been a city in the east that meant something, Constantinople, the last living fragment of the Roman world, a place of walls that had never truly fallen, of churches heavy with gold and incense, of an emperor who still called himself the heir of Caesar, even as his empire shrank to little more than the city itself. For generations, that city had been the shield of Christian Europe against the armies of the East, cracked, poor, and surrounded, but standing. Then, in the spring of 1453, it fell. The young Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, brought the walls down with cannon larger than anything the world had seen, and when the smoke cleared, the thing that had stood for 1,000 years was simply gone. The news travelled across Europe like a cold wind. Kings who had ignored the danger for decades suddenly understood that the tide had turned and that it was moving toward them. This is the world you must hold in your mind. Not a stable map with neat borders, but a landscape in motion. The Ottoman Empire was not a distant threat on the horizon. It was a rising sea, and it was climbing. The Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Greece, were being pulled under one region at a time. Some rulers fought, many more knelt, paid tribute, sent their sons as hostages, and hoped the storm would pass over them. It rarely did. And in the middle of this collapsing world sat a small, mountainous, stubborn land on the Adriatic coast, Albania. To an outsider, Albania looked like an afterthought. It had no great cities to rival Constantinople. It had no single unified kingdom, only a patchwork of rival noble families who spent nearly as much energy fighting each other as fighting outsiders. Its wealth was modest. Its population was small. On paper, it should have been swallowed as quickly and quietly as its neighbours. But Albania had two things that mattered more than gold. The first was the land itself. This was a country of near-vertical mountains, of narrow passes where a handful of men could hold back an army, of forests and ravines where a large force could be blinded and bled. An empire that fought its wars with huge armies and heavy supply trains found this terrain to be a nightmare. The mountains did not care how many soldiers you had. They swallowed numbers. The second thing Albania had was a man. And to understand why this particular strip of coast became a wound that the Ottoman Empire could not close for a quarter of a century, you have to understand him. Because the story of Albulena is not really the story of a battle. It is the story of a single mind that had learned to fight from the inside of the very empire now trying to destroy him. To find that mind, we have to go back before the sieges, before the rebellion, to a boy taken from his home as a hostage and raised to become the Sultan's perfect weapon. A weapon that would one day turn in the Sultan's hand. There was a custom in the Ottoman world, cold and effective. When a small ruler submitted to the Sultan, he was often required to hand over his sons. The boys were taken to the imperial court, raised as Muslims, trained as soldiers, and turned into loyal servants of the empire. It was insurance and conquest in one. It bound the father to good behaviour, and it turned the son into an Ottoman. Sometime in his boyhood, one of those hostages was a son of Hamza Kastrioti, a lord of the Albanian highlands. His birth name was George. The Ottomans gave him a new one. Because of his skill and his ferocity, they called him after Alexander the Great, Iskander. And with the honorific Bey, meaning lord, the name became the one history would remember, Skanderbeg. The empire did not waste him. He was educated, trained in the arts of war, and sent to fight the Sultan's campaigns across the Balkans and beyond. And here is the uncomfortable truth that the clean legend often skips over. For years, Skanderbeg was not the enemy of the Ottoman Empire. He was one of its most capable commanders. He led its armies, he won its battles. He learned from the inside exactly how the largest military machine of the age thought, marched, camped, and fought. He learned its strengths, the discipline, the artillery, the endless supply of men, and he learned its weaknesses. That education would one day cost the empire everything on the plain of Albulena. The break came in the year 1443. The Ottomans were fighting a difficult campaign against a Christian coalition in the Balkans, and the fortunes of war had turned against them near the town of Niš. In the confusion of that campaign, Skanderbeg made his decision. He abandoned the Sultan's army, gathered a small band of fellow Albanians and rode hard for home. He seized the fortress of Kruja, the strongest hold in central Albania, reportedly using forged documents to gain entry before the garrison understood what was happening. And there, on the walls of his father's old lands, he raised a banner that would define the rest of his life, a black double-headed eagle on a field of blood red. The message was unmistakable. The Sultan's weapon had turned. But one man with one fortress does not make a war. Skanderbeg understood something that most rebels never grasp. He knew that Albania's greatest weakness was itself, its endless feuds, its jealous noble families, its inability to act as one. So in the year 1444, he did something remarkable. He gathered the rival lords of Albania in the town of Leisure and persuaded them to set aside their quarrels and form a single alliance against the empire. History remembers it as the League of Leisure. It was fragile. It was full of men who distrusted one another. It would fracture and strain many times over the coming years. But for the first time, the mountains had a unified sword, and at the head of that sword stood a commander who had learned to fight by being one of the empire's own. The Ottomans now faced an enemy who knew their every move before they made it. The war that followed would last on and off for the rest of Skanderbeg's life, and it would grind both sides to the bone. Understand what Skanderbeg was up against, because it puts everything that follows into its proper staggering perspective. The Ottoman Empire could field armies of tens of thousands. It had a professional corps of soldiers, the famous Janissaries, drilled and disciplined in a way that most of Europe could not match. It had cannon. It had cavalry beyond counting. It had a treasury deep enough to keep armies in the field year after year, and a population deep enough to replace every man it lost. When the empire decided it wanted something, it could simply keep coming, wave after wave, until the thing it wanted was worn down and taken. Against all of this, Skanderbeg commanded a force that, at its strongest, numbered only in the low tens of thousands, and often far less. His men were tough mountain fighters, brave and loyal, but they were few, and every single one he lost was almost impossible to replace. He could not win a war of attrition. If he stood in an open field and traded blow for blow with the full weight of the empire, he would lose. It was simple arithmetic, and Skanderbeg understood arithmetic. So he did not fight the empire's war, he fought his own. He turned the mountains into a weapon. When a great Ottoman army marched into Albania, Skanderbeg rarely met it head-on. Instead, he vanished. He would break his forces into fast-moving bands, striking at supply lines, ambushing columns in narrow passes, falling on stragglers and foraging parties, and then melting away before the enemy could bring its full strength to bear. He fought at night. He fought from high ground. He hit and withdrew, letting the mountains do to the great army what he could not do himself: starve it, exhaust it, and blind it. For an empire used to overwhelming its enemies, this was maddening. The Ottomans would march in with a huge force, burn villages, besiege a fortress, and find that the enemy simply would not stand and fight. Their supplies would dwindle, their men would sicken, and all the while, the Albanians would bleed them from the shadows. Time and again, the empire launched campaigns to crush Skanderbeg once and for all, and time and again those campaigns ground themselves to pieces against the mountains and the man who commanded them. The fortress of Kruja became the symbol of this stubbornness. More than once the Ottomans threw their strength against those walls, and more than once they were forced to withdraw. The empire that had broken the walls of Constantinople could not break a mountain town defended by a former servant it had trained itself. Skanderbeg became something more than a rebel in the imagination of his own people and his enemies. He became an archetype, the dragon of the mountains, the commander who could not be pinned down or worn out. The Pope in Rome hailed him as a defender of Christendom, a shield of the West. Kings and princes sent him money and encouragement, though rarely the armies he truly needed. He became a legend in his own lifetime, the one man holding a door shut against the tide. But legends are exhausting to be. Behind the myth was a man who was always short of soldiers, always short of money, always one betrayal or one bad season away from disaster. And as the years wore on, the strain began to show. The empire had time on its side. It could afford to lose battles. Skanderbeg could not. And in the year 1457, that pressure would find its cruelest possible form. Not in a new army, but in a familiar face. By the mid-1450s, the war had been grinding on for more than a decade, and it was taking its toll. Skanderbeg's greatest strength, the League of Leisure, that fragile alliance of proud Albanian families, was also his greatest vulnerability. Alliances built on shared fear are strong when the enemy is at the gate and weak when the enemy pauses to whisper. And the Ottoman Empire was a master of whispering. It did not only fight with armies, it fought with gold, with promises, with titles, and with the patient, corrosive work of turning a man's own people against him. The empire understood that it might never defeat Skanderbeg in the field, but it could try to hollow him out from within. And it found the perfect instrument close to home. His name was Hamza Kastrioti, and he was Skanderbeg's own nephew. Hamza had fought at his uncle's side for years. He was a capable soldier, a member of the ruling family, a man who had every reason to believe that his loyalty and his blood entitled him to a great future. But something curdled. The sources point to a wound over inheritance and standing, a sense that Hamza believed himself passed over, that his place in the family and its fortunes was smaller than he thought it should be. When Skanderbeg's own line produced an heir, whatever hopes Hamza held for succession seemed to close. Ambition, once denied, has a way of rotting into resentment, and resentment in the 15th century was a door through which the empire could walk. Around the year 1456, Hamza Kastrioti made his choice. He abandoned his uncle. He crossed over to the Ottomans, converted, and offered them the one thing they had lacked in all their years of failure against Skanderbeg, a commander who knew the Albanian way of war from the inside. Just as Skanderbeg had once turned the Sultan's training against the empire, now the empire had a Kastrioti of its own to turn against Skanderbeg. Think about what that meant. Hamza did not merely know Skanderbeg's fortresses and forces. He knew his mind. He knew the tricks, the ambushes, the pattern of vanish and strike that had frustrated the empire for so long. He could tell the Sultan exactly how his uncle fought and how to counter it. For the Ottomans, this was worth more than another 10,000 men. For Skanderbeg, it was a wound of a different kind. He had faced armies before. He had faced overwhelming numbers, siege guns, and the full weight of the empire. But now he faced betrayal from within his own house, from a man who had eaten at his table. The war was no longer only strategic, it was personal, and it was bitter. And the empire moved to exploit it at the worst possible moment. Skanderbeg was already stretched thin. His resources were exhausted after years of fighting. Promised help from the west was slow and uncertain. His alliance was frayed. Some of his own nobles wavered. To much of Europe, watching from a comfortable distance, it looked as though the dragon of the mountains had finally been cornered. The empire smelled blood, and it prepared to deliver the killing blow. In the year 1457, it assembled one of the largest forces it had ever sent against Albania, placed experienced commanders at its head, and included among them the one man who knew Skanderbeg best, his own nephew. The trap was set, and the empire was certain this time that it would spring shut. In the year 1457, the great Ottoman army came into Albania. The chronicles put its size at staggering numbers, figures that reached towards 70,000 and beyond, with some accounts stretching even higher. We should be honest about those numbers. Medieval writers routinely inflated the size of armies, especially enemy armies, to make victories more glorious and defeats more forgivable. The true figure was almost certainly smaller than the largest claims, but even by the most cautious modern estimates, this was an enormous host, far larger than anything Skanderbeg could hope to match in open battle. At its head rode two commanders. One was an experienced Ottoman general, Isak Bey Evrenos, from a family that had fought in the Balkans for generations. The other was Hamza Kastrioti, the nephew, the traitor, guiding the empire straight into his uncle's homeland. Their mission was simple and total: not to raid, not to negotiate, to end the rebellion once and for all. And Skanderbeg, facing this hammer, did the thing he had always done best. He disappeared. He did not gather his outnumbered men and offer battle. That is what a proud man does, and pride loses wars. Instead, he pulled back into the mountains he knew better than any living soul, scattered his forces, and refused to give the empire the one thing it wanted: a target. The great army marched and found nothing to crush. It besieged, and the defenders held or slipped away. It hunted, and the prey was always just gone, over the next ridge, into the next ravine. For weeks, and by some accounts, for months, this went on. The Ottoman host spread across the Albanian countryside. It pillaged. It burned. It took what it wanted from the land, because a large army must eat, and eating meant scattering foragers across a wide area. And here is the crucial thing, the thing Skanderbeg was counting on. As the weeks dragged by without a decisive battle, something began to happen inside that enormous army. It grew comfortable. The empire's commanders looked around at a land they had ravaged, and an enemy they could not even find, and they drew the natural conclusion. The war was already won. Skanderbeg was finished, hiding, broken, unable to fight. There was nothing left to do but occupy the ground and wait for the surrender. Discipline, which is hard to maintain in a huge force living off the land, began to slacken. The great host, so terrifying when it marched as one, spread out, relaxed, and let its guard down. Overconfidence is the most dangerous feeling an army can carry, and Skanderbeg had spent his entire career learning how to feed it. From the high ground, hidden, patient, he watched. He watched the foraging parties wander farther and farther from the main camp. He watched the sentries grow careless. He watched the sprawling, arrogant, victorious-feeling army convince itself that the danger had passed. And somewhere in those weeks of watching, the vanished dragon saw the opening he had been waiting for. The very size of the enemy, the thing that made it so terrifying, had become its weakness. It was too large to stay sharp. It was too confident to stay ready. It had stopped hunting and started resting. That was the moment. Not the moment to survive, the moment to strike. A great commander does not simply attack when he sees an opening. He shapes the moment before he seizes it. Through those long weeks of vanishing, Skanderbeg had not been idle. He had been doing the quiet, unglamorous work that wins battles before they are fought. He gathered his scattered forces, calling in the bands he had broken apart, drawing them together in secret from across the mountains. He gathered intelligence, the position of the enemy camp, the movements of its patrols, the rhythm of its days and nights, the places where its guard was weakest. And he waited for the enemy's confidence to ripen into carelessness. His force, when assembled, was small. The exact number is uncertain, but it was a fraction of the host it was about to face, a body of tough, experienced cavalry and fighters, men who had followed Skanderbeg through years of this brutal war and trusted his judgment with their lives. They could not win a stand-up fight against the full Ottoman army. Everyone knew it. That was never the plan. The plan depended on the one advantage a small force can hold over a giant one. Surprise. Consider the psychology of what Skanderbeg was about to do. His men were outnumbered many times over. They were being asked to ride in darkness into the camp of the most powerful empire in the world. Every instinct of self-preservation would scream against it. And yet these were men who had learned, over long years, that their commander did not throw their lives away. He did not fight battles he could not win. If Skanderbeg said the moment had come, then the moment had come. That trust, built over a decade of shared danger, was itself a weapon. The location mattered too. The confrontation would come on a plain the Albanians knew as Albulena, near the river Eshem. Open ground, but ground that Skanderbeg's men knew, and the enemy did not truly control. The Ottoman camp there had grown sprawling and slack, an army at rest in a land it believed it had conquered. There is a lesson buried in this that goes beyond the 15th century. Overwhelming strength breeds a particular kind of blindness. When you're certain you have already won, you stop looking for the threat. You post fewer guards, you let your soldiers wander, you sleep more soundly. The larger and more confident the force, the harder it is to keep every part of it alert, and the more catastrophic the failure when one part is caught off guard. Skanderbeg had spent his whole career studying exactly this failure. He knew that the empire's greatest asset, its crushing size, could in the right moment be turned into its greatest liability. And so, as the light failed on the plain of Albulena, the pieces were in place. The great Ottoman host lay sprawled and confident in its camp, certain the war was already over, its commanders content, its guard down. And out in the darkness, gathered and silent, waited a small force of mountain warriors led by a man who had learned the empire's every habit from the inside, and who had spent weeks giving that empire exactly the false sense of victory he needed it to feel. The trap the empire thought it had set for Skanderbeg was about to close on the empire instead. All that remained was the signal to strike, and when it came, it would come out of the dark all at once, in the last place the great army expected to be attacked, its own beds. Picture the Ottoman camp in the hours before dawn, an army at rest, cook fires burned down to embers, thousands of men asleep beneath the open sky, their weapons stacked, their horses picketed, their sentries few and drowsy. This was a force that had marched, burned and pillaged for weeks, and had convinced itself there was nothing left to fear. The war, as far as they were concerned, was over. They were an occupying army now, waiting for a surrender that would surely come. They never heard Skanderbeg coming. Out of the darkness, all at once, his cavalry struck. There was no long approach, no exchange of arrows, no time for the great host to form its lines and bring its numbers to bear. That was the entire point. Skanderbeg did not attack the Ottoman army. He attacked a sleeping camp. And a sleeping camp, no matter how large, is not an army. It is a crowd of vulnerable men. The horror of that moment for the Ottomans was not the size of the force hitting them. It was the confusion. Imagine waking in the dark to the thunder of hooves, to shouting, to the sudden knowledge that the enemy you believed was broken, and hiding was somehow inside your camp. In that first chaos, no one could tell how many attackers there were. For all the sleeping soldiers knew, the whole Albanian nation had fallen upon them. Men woke with no weapons in their hands, no idea where their units were, no commander to rally them, no line to stand in. And an army that cannot form up is not a fighting force, it is a mob. This is the terrible mathematics that Skanderbeg understood better than anyone alive. Numbers only matter if you can use them. 70,000 men are unstoppable when they stand shoulder to shoulder in disciplined ranks. But 70,000 men scattered, half asleep, and blind in the dark are worse than useless. They are a danger to one another. In the panic, men trampled their own. Horses broke loose and stampeded through the camp. Whole sections of the host, unable to see the enemy or understand what was happening, simply broke and ran, and their flight spread the panic further. Fear moved through that camp faster than any sword. Skanderbeg's men, by contrast, knew exactly what they were doing. They knew their objective, they knew their commander, and they knew that speed and shock were everything. They tore through the disintegrating camp, striking at the points of greatest confusion, giving the enemy no chance to recover, no still moment in which the great army might remember its own strength and turn to face them. Within hours, not days, not a long grinding battle, but hours, the largest force the Empire had sent against Albania in years had ceased to exist as a fighting army. What had been a mighty host was now a routed, fleeing, terrified mass of men running into the dark, hunted as they ran. The great army did not lose because it was outfought. It lost because it was never given the chance to fight. It lost because it had grown so certain of victory that it forgot the first rule of war, that the enemy gets a say. And somewhere in the wreckage of that night, in the chaos of the collapsing camp, a traitor's confidence collapsed with it. Hamza Kastrioti, who had guided the empire into his uncle's homeland, who had promised to deliver Skanderbeg at last, found the ground turning to nightmare beneath his feet. The trap he had helped to build had swallowed the trappers, and before the sun rose over the plain of Albulena, the war would deliver him to the one man in the world he least wanted to face. When the light finally came to the plain of Albulena, it revealed the scale of what had happened in the dark. The Ottoman army was gone, not defeated in the usual sense, not bloodied and withdrawn in good order, but shattered, scattered, and fleeing. The chroniclers describe an overwhelming victory, with the enemy host broken and thousands of prisoners taken. As always, we should hold the largest figures at arm's length. The accounts speak of many thousands slain and many thousands more captured, and while the precise numbers are lost to the fog of medieval record-keeping, there is no serious doubt about the outcome. It was one of the most complete victories of Skanderbeg's entire career. A small force had annihilated a great one in a single night, and then there was Hamza. The traitor was taken alive, dragged from the ruin of the army he had led into Albania, bound and brought before Skanderbeg. Picture that reunion. The uncle and the nephew, the commander and the man who had betrayed him, face to face at last on a field littered with the wreckage of the Empire's certainty. Everything about the moment demanded vengeance. Hamza had abandoned his family, converted to the enemy's cause, and guided a massive army into his homeland with the express purpose of destroying his own uncle. In the world of the 15th century, treachery of that scale was almost always answered with death, and no one would have blamed Skanderbeg for taking it. But Skanderbeg did not kill him. This is one of the most revealing moments in the whole story, and it complicates the simple picture of the vengeful warlord. Rather than execute his nephew, Skanderbeg sent Hamza away as a prisoner, handed over, according to the accounts, into the keeping of others, removed from Albania rather than put to the sword. It was, in its way, an act of restraint that speaks to something beyond mere brutality. Whether it came from lingering family feeling, from political calculation, from a desire to appear merciful in the eyes of Europe, or from some combination of all three, we cannot fully know. But it tells us that the Dragon of the Mountains was not a simple engine of slaughter. He was a man capable of holding, even against the man who wronged him most, a measure of something harder than hatred. The victory itself sent a shockwave far beyond Albania. Word spread across Europe that Skanderbeg, the man half the continent had written off as cornered and finished, had not only survived the Empire's greatest effort to destroy him, he had crushed it. The Pope celebrated. Christian rulers who had watched the Ottoman tide rise with dread suddenly had proof that the Empire could be beaten, that its armies were not invincible, that a determined defender in the right terrain could humble the power that had taken Constantinople. In an age heavy with defeat and retreat, Albulena was a rare and blazing piece of good news. But wars are not won by single nights, however glorious. Skanderbeg understood this better than the crowds who cheered his name. The Empire was wounded, embarrassed, and set back. But it was not destroyed. It had lost an army, it could raise another. It had lost a campaign. It had not lost its will. The tide had been thrown back for a moment, but the sea was still rising. And so, even in the flush of one of history's great upsets, the deeper question remained. What does a single, stunning victory truly change when it is won by the few against the many, in a war where the many can always come again? In the immediate aftermath of Albulena, the world seemed to shift in Skanderbeg's favour. The scale of the victory brought him something precious in that long war, time and standing. The Empire, stung by the disaster, agreed to a truce not long after. For a man who had spent more than a decade fighting a power that could always send another army, a pause was itself a kind of triumph. It gave the mountains a chance to breathe, the alliance a chance to steady, and the legend a chance to grow. The name of Skanderbeg now stood higher than ever, in his own land and across Christendom, the commander who had beaten the unbeatable. But history is rarely kind to small nations wedged against great empires, and the deeper truth of Albulena is a harder one. The victory was extraordinary, but it did not change the fundamental arithmetic of the war. The Ottoman Empire remained vast, wealthy, and patient. It could absorb a defeat like Albulena and keep coming. Skanderbeg, for all his genius, remained the leader of a small, poor, divided land, forever short of the men and money he needed, forever waiting for a Western help that mostly never came in the strength that was promised. He would fight on for years more, winning and enduring, holding his door against the tide until his death in the year 1468. And when he died, the door began to close. Without the one mind that had held the alliance together and turned the mountains into a weapon, the resistance could not last. Within roughly a decade of his death, Crewe itself, the fortress that had defied the empire for so long, finally fell. Albania was drawn under the Ottoman Sea as its neighbours had been before it. In the coldest strategic terms, the empire won the long war. So what then was Albulena? What does that single stunning night truly mean, if the nation that produced it was ultimately conquered anyway? Here is where the story stops being about tactics and becomes something larger. Albulena matters still, precisely because it should not have been possible. It stands as one of history's clearest proofs that overwhelming force is not the same as certain victory, that size, unguarded, becomes weakness, that a single mind, patient and disciplined, can turn an enemy's greatest strength into the instrument of its own ruin. Skanderbeg did not have more men, more gold, or more resources. He had knowledge, patience, and the nerve to strike at exactly the right moment. And for one night on the plain of Albulena, that was enough to humble a superpower. For the Albanian people, Skanderbeg became more than a general. He became the symbol of a nation's refusal to disappear quietly, the memory that they had once stood against the greatest empire of the age and made it bleed. That memory outlasted the conquest. It outlasted the empire itself. Centuries later, when Albania sought its own identity and independence, it reached back to the black double-headed eagle on the red field, the very banner Skanderbeg had raised over Cruja. The man was gone, the nation was conquered, but the symbol endured and the story refused to die, which leaves us at the end with the question the whole story has been circling. Was Skanderbeg a hero, the shield of his people, the defender who held the line against impossible odds? Or was he something more complicated? A former servant of the empire who turned traitor to his masters, a man whose war was in part a family war, who could annihilate an army in a single night and yet spare the nephew who betrayed him? Perhaps the truest answer is that he was all of these at once. History rarely gives us clean heroes. It gives us human beings, caught in impossible worlds making impossible choices. And on one dark night in the autumn of 1457, on a quiet plain in the Albanian mountains, one such human being reminded the most powerful empire on earth that the mountains still had a defender, and that no army, however vast, is ever truly safe when it forgets to fear. What do you think? Was Skanderbeg the hero Europe called him, or something harder to name? Leave your answer in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from.